Jaman has invoked Parley, and you can sign up to do the same. Behold, Parley about Hans Christian Andersen and Fate Grand Order. Jaman asks, why is the Fate version of Hans Christian Andersen such a bastardization of the real historical figure? Siberg showed me the character in the game, and I am fuming with anger and disappointment. I'm going to challenge myself with this question to answer in a timely manner, even though there's a lot to cover here. So let's get started. The Fate franchise is a Japanese historical fantasy property created by Kinoko Nasu and featuring historical figures summoned as magical familiars called servants to fight in magical wars over magical MacGuffins called Holy Grails that can grant wishes. In the franchise, children's fairy tale author Hans Christian Andersen, who wrote The Little Mermaid and some other stuff, is considered to be famous enough to qualify as a servant that could be summoned. Other obvious or not so obvious figures that could qualify as servants would be, for example, famous fictional English detective Sherlock Holmes, legendary Japanese swordmaster Miyamoto Musashi, and the first Tsar of Russia, Ivan the Terrible, to name only a few. Fate has had visual novels and anime adaptations in spades, with more coming all the time, but the crown jewel of the franchise, at least from a financial perspective, is Fate Grand Order, a mobile, turn-based combat game with a gachapon microtransaction economy that grosses $1 million gajillion every year and fuels all sorts of Fate spin-offs. Okay, so recontextualized, Jaman's question is, in that thing I just described, why is Hans Christian Andersen such a, quote, bastardization of the real historical figure? In other words, why is he summoned that way? What Jaman is referring to is the fact that in Fate Extra and Fate Grand Order, you encounter or summon Hans Christian Andersen, the servant, in a child's body. Fate has a lot of this kind of thing. King Arthur is a girl, Spartacus is a giant explosive rage beast with gray skin, Attila the Hun is also a girl, yeah. But one of the fun things about Fate Grand Order is that you can get to know the servants you summon, and they give you a lot of dialogue and information, as well as some environmental storytelling through their gameplay. Fate Grand Order's answer to Jaman's question, why is Andersen a child, is given by Andersen himself. Servants are summoned in their prime, and Andersen feels that he was in his prime as a writer when he was a child, since he had the most creative energy and hope. As some of you may know, the real Andersen didn't lead the happiest life, so his servant form reflects that, avoiding the memory of his adult life by incarnating as a child. Andersen the servant is still mentally an adult, almost all servants are, but he's summoned in the form of what's determined to be his prime. Where this gets a bit weird and heavy-handed is that a servant's prime is not always defined by them. Servants are servants because they're legends, so sometimes it's not they themselves that define their legend. Yet, other times it is. Now, for our case, you could argue that since Andersen was a children's author, writing him as a child makes some sense. But since Fate Grand Order jerks this legend definition concept around, we have to ask if there's another motivation here. Personally, I think it would make sense if it was because he's a writer servant, of which there are a ton, and it's hard to make them look distinct. They're just writers. They didn't have any crazy fantasy combat gear. But Andersen was in Fate Extra first, and this thing that I'm going to describe would not have been a problem there, so I'll still explain what I mean, but this is just an idea. Almost all writers in history end up qualifying as caster class servants in Fate Grand Order, so effectively mages focused on support and buffing their allies, which leads to a tricky situation if they all look similar, where an entire category of characters would all look alike, and be found in the same place in the same role. A good example from the game of this being a problem already is the way in which Shakespeare and Mozart, two low-ranking casters that most players encounter, don't feel very distinct except in a few gameplay scenarios, certainly not visually. So I don't know, there's a lot of words to say about Andersen being a small boy, but that's an example of what could be a reason. Of course, it doesn't make sense because he was in Fate Extra first. I don't know. My best explanation is that this is a really weird franchise that gets very fanciful with its character designs, and they just wanted the children's writer to be a child. I rather like Andersen from a gameplay perspective, since we're on the topic. He's very powerful, especially for how easy he is to power up fully, and he has some fun combo potential. His Noble Phantasm, that's basically his big special ability that represents his legend, is literally him writing about your other servants so they get a smattering of random buffs. What you can do is bring along, say, Ramses, who has a skill that increases your luck with passive effects, and if you use Andersen's Noble Phantasm after that, you're almost guaranteed to get all of the buffs, and your whole front line becomes quite powerful and hard to kill for 3 turns. If you play Fate Grand Order, make sure to hold on to Andersen. He's definitely not a bastardization in the gameplay sense, at least, but I definitely understand the confusion. Personally, I do think it's kind of cool that he gives the explanation that he thought his prime represented him better if he was a child. I don't know, but there definitely are some of these that are a bit hand of the author. You can really feel the game jerking around that concept and using it to make a character design it preferred rather than one that actually makes sense. So your mileage may vary. I've been Zandy, and I want to thank Jaman once again for their support. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have something to take care of.